has asked to convey his greetings and his regrets. He looks forward to being at this meeting, to discussing with you the condition of humanity and the future of the United Nations, as well as to exchanging ideas with you on specific problems confronting the world. He regrets deeply that his illness prevents him from being here, but he joins with me in thanking C.V. Narasimhan, the Undersecretary General of the United Nations, and Mr. George Bush, who represented the United States here at the United Nations, and who recently has been, and for all I know may at this moment may still be, the chairman of the Republican National Committee and the envoy designate, if that is the correct title, Ambassador Bush, to the People's Republic of China. We propose today to do what we intended to do originally, namely to discuss the condition of humanity and the prospects of the United Nations. And I think we could have no better theme for that discussion than was represented by the report in today's newspapers of the State of the World report by the Secretary General himself. In that report, the Secretary General identified the principal problems confronting every human being on Earth, problems represented by the accumulation of weapons far beyond any imaginable needs, the dangers represented by these weapons, accident, miscalculation, and also the danger of war in which these weapons can be used, or other weapons. Dangers with respect to the fact that the Earth was rapidly becoming uninhabitable, the environment is being poisoned, land is eroding, hunger is growing, mouths are increasing. And with respect to all these problems, unresolved tensions among nations, he echoes the warning of his predecessor, Yuthon, with respect to the fact that the problems, they seem to have about them an aspect of infinity, but time is very finite in which those problems can be met. The Secretary General also called attention to perhaps the most serious problem of all, which is the growing helplessness he finds among peoples all over the world in the face of these problems. Mr. Little, a few minutes ago, called attention to cynicism, lack of hope with respect to these problems, and this is the prime concern of the Secretary General. And in that sense, I suppose that the ultimate problem is not represented by the arms race or by population pressure or by famine or environmental deterioration. The ultimate problem, it seems to me, is represented by the perception that humans have of themselves. How do we define a human being? How do we define the uniqueness of a human being? What is our conception of the ability of a human being to meet any challenge that can be defined? I don't know how we can define human uniqueness except to say that a human being is a creature that can do something for the first time. That being the case, any problem that is definable should be solvable, or at least resolvable. CV, the reason I call him CV is how he is universally known at the UN, and he comes here not in his role as an expert tennis player, although I noticed the last time we played that he was a half step slower in getting to the net than he was a year ago. Seriously, CV, I'd be grateful to you if you could attempt to summarize for us some of the highlights of the Secretary's report today on the state of the world.
Thank you, Norman. Of course, we are all very sorry that the Secretary General he is not with us this evening. And I must admit that I am a very inadequate substitute for him. But I am very glad to be here with Norman on this occasion. And I am particularly happy that George Bush is with us today. During the years that he worked at the United Nations, he made friends everywhere, and we were all very sorry to see him go. Now he is going to China as the envoy of the United States to the People's Republic. I must tell him that this has happened to many people from the United Nations before, as he knows. So he will be finding there quite a few people who used to work at the United Nations at some time. And conversely, I might say, many people who have worked in the People's Republic of China have come back to the United Nations. I could give you a list of 10 names if I wanted to from the top of my head. But I hope that we might have occasion to welcome George Bush again at the United Nations. It will be a very happy occasion indeed that we could have him. I am told of a story of a United Nations delegate who went to heaven, and St. Peter welcomed him and he said, "You will find many of your friends here." And he looked around and he couldn't find a single soul he knew. So he went back to Peter and he said, "Did you tell me that I will find many of my friends from the United Nations here?" And St. Peter said, "Indeed." And the diplomat said, "I have looked everywhere, I couldn't find a single one." And St. Peter asked him, "Have you looked into the delegates' lounge yet?" Now, so far as the Saturday Review and Norman Cousins are concerned, I must say I cannot think of anything more appropriate than that the 50th anniversary of Saturday Review, and what is it, for you 35 years now with the Saturday Review? Because I do recall that Uthant and I paid a very carefully concealed surprise visit to Norman on the occasion of his Silver Jubilee at Saturday Review. And for me it was a very heartwarming occasion. I say this with no desire to flatter Norman. We often talk about these pressing global problems of human survival, welfare and progress, which are the theme of the Secretary General's introduction, to which I would refer in a minute. Like the weather, we all talk about it. There are very few of us who try to do something about it. Norman is one of those rare breed of human beings who tries to do something about it. And I feel that it's a great occasion for us to have Norman here in our midst on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Saturday Review World magazine. And I hope, Norman, you will have great success, greater success even than before, when you are continuing efforts to deal with these global problems, to which you have drawn attention in the columns of the Saturday Review for so many years. Of course, I must admit that I look at the cartoons before I read Norman Cousins, but I am sure that ultimately I get down to Norman Cousins' column. It is true, as the reports in the newspapers this morning, especially the fairly full coverage in the New York Times, indicates that the Secretary General's report on the world situation, the introduction to the annual report on the work of the organization, is cast in a somewhat apprehensive and gloomy tone. The Secretary General says, "I do not wish to conceal my profound concern about the situation which now prevails in the world, a concern which I know to be shared by responsible people everywhere." That means all of you who are present here today. There is an almost universal sense of apprehension about where the tumultuous developments of our time may take us, a sense of deep anxiety at phenomena which you do not fully understand, let alone control. In all the speculation, much of it depressing about the shape of the future, there recurs a note of helplessness and fatalism, which I find deeply disturbing. This is not a new phenomenon. Dire prophecies have often been made before in regard to during periods of transition and change in human society. What is new is the scope and scale of the problems which give rise to these apprehensions. They are problems of the world as a whole, outside the range or control of any single nation or group, however powerful. And this indeed is very true. Norman referred to various problems. They are all there. Take, for example, disarmament. A very well-conceived treaty in regard to nuclear non-proliferation was adopted by the General Assembly several years ago. Now, this treaty tried to do two things. It tried to prevent horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons. In other words, the nuclear club should remain at a very small number of countries which already had become nuclear powers. But it also contemplated that an effort would be made by the existing nuclear powers to reduce their levels of nuclear armaments, what is called vertical non-proliferation. And the strategic arms limitation talks were one element in this. Well, they have not made sufficient progress, certainly. Some progress has been made, but nothing like what needs to be done in this field. There is just one part of the total story. Take, for example, the economic front. The thing that in the economic field that stares us in the face is the tremendous disparity in living standards between the rich and the poor countries. And this was the theme of the special session of the United Nations, which met just about 4 months ago in these very halls. We talk about the problems of food and population. The population conference has just concluded its session. I'll be happy to say a little about that conference later on. The food conference is due to meet later this year, but in between, it is possible that the world might be facing already a very acute shortage of food, affecting the lives, in fact, the possible survival of not just a few, but millions of human beings. There's the problem of energy, there's the problem of environment, there's the problem of inflation, which affects rich countries and poor countries alike today. Now, what is common about all these problems? The common thing about all these problems is that it is not confined to one country. It is not confined to one class of people. It affects the rich and the poor alike. It shows what was repeatedly stressed at the special session of the General Assembly, that we are living in an interdependent world. And solutions to these problems could not be found in the context of one country or one nation, however rich and however well endowed. Such efforts will indeed prove self-defeating. We have to find solutions for these problems in a global context, and that's where the United Nations comes in. Norman referred to this feeling of tenseness amongst nations. The Secretary General's report deals with that at great length. The most recent, of course, is the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Cyprus, to which the Secretary General paid a visit so recently. The continuing situation in the Middle East, which is a source of concern to the Secretary General, I know. And the fact that in Southeast Asia, after 20 months after Paris, the peace conference, we have still not made much progress towards durable peace in that area. These are all certainly causes for concern. I am glad to see that in the Indian subcontinent, where I come from, there has been some progress in this regard. And at the same time, at the international level, amongst the great powers, there is a willingness to talk about problems, and there is a willingness to recognize the difficulties of the other side and an attempt to reach solutions which are meaningful. That is on the plus side. But on the whole, we are facing a very difficult situation. Some of them are issues which are of long-term character, some of a short. Problems has to be found, preferably, I should say almost inevitably, in a global context. And that's where the United Nations comes in. And I feel, therefore, it's particularly appropriate that these problems to which Norman, you and Saturday Review World have given so much attention during the last 2 or 3 years, and before that Saturday Review for as long as I have been a reader, which is almost 15 years, more than 15 years. It is fitting that we should discuss these problems at the United Nations. I am sure that on many of these issues, George Bush, who has a particularly good vantage point, having been an insider and having been an outsider now for some time, I am sure he will have a great deal to say. But this is how I see it, and I feel that in this House, we must all cooperate and find solutions for these problems, because otherwise I am afraid that the future of the human race itself is very much a question mark. Thank you.
Thanks very much, CV. Ambassador Bush. If, please. Thank you, CV. Ambassador Bush, if we agree, therefore, that the main problems of our time are world problems, and if we agree that a world response is the only way these problems can be met, and if we further agree that the only agency which gives promise of mounting that world response is the United Nations, and if we believe that the United Nations does need to be strengthened in order to do that particular job, can that be done without giving the world's peoples an increased awareness of the need to strengthen the United Nations? And if so, how do we go about doing that?
Wow. Norman, thank you, and I'm very pleased to be here. I am a rather inadequate substitute for my friend and, much more important, the distinguished Secretary General of the United Nations. He sent an able, very able substitute in CV who is known in UN circles and indeed in many governments as perhaps one of 3 or 4 people possessing kind of all the knowledge there is about the UN. I found it when I came here as ambassador for our country, and CV couldn't have been more helpful, and you can see now why we all share that respect for him. Typical cousin's courtesy, I was met at the airport by a very beautiful girl and handed a sinister list of questions, all about kind of the situation in some conference here or some drought there, and, you know, some horrible questions. And I profess that I felt I would be overawed even sitting in this audience. Anybody that understands the Saturday Review, I have great respect for, and I was very flattered when, and reads it say nothing less, you know, but I was honored and flattered when Norman put the arm on me and said, listen, come on up here, and I came because I thought I might learn a little something rather than contributing much. But I do want to respond to your question. I will tell you, not to try to trump CV, who is known as has the greatest repertoire of jokes in the United Nations of anybody that's ever tread in these hallowed halls, but I remember, and this isn't a joke exactly, it's a fact, but when I was nominated by the President to leave the United Nations and become chairman of the Republican National Committee, there was a great deal of confusion about that move in many sources, but our distinguished colleague, Ambassador Wang Hua, who is the ambassador here from very able diplomat, and I'd say politically oriented as well, in the finest sense of the word, from the People's Republic of China, came up to me and he said, he had a going away reception over here, and he said, now, Ambassador, now you will not be ambassador, you will be Chairman Bush. And I thought a minute, you know, about their system and our system, and I said, yeah, but there's one hell of a big difference, believe me, and little did I know how accurate my comments were when walking into the thing I walked into. But now I'm going over to China to see their system in action and to hopefully present some of our views to them and certainly to learn from them. They've got an immensely complicated system, and they've done as CV knows, in many ways a wonderful job, and I'm very honored to be taking on this new challenge. I'm less pessimistic. I'll be honest, I didn't see this morning. I'm trying to get out of the job I'm in and start learning something about the new one, so I didn't even read the New York Times today, which is a heretical thing to say in this audience, but I didn't read it, and I didn't therefore see the Secretary General's report, which I, of course, will read in total and with avid interest. But I'm less pessimistic about world peace than I was the 2 years ago that I left here. And some of it relates to my hopes for the United Nations, and its, I would hope, increasing ability to cope with economic and social problems, although we've got enormous ones staring us in the face that defy solution right now, particularly in Africa. And some of it relates to a certain civility between large powers that I think has come about some because, or has been enhanced by the ending of our participation in the war in Southeast Asia, and also by an increasing, just day by day, realization that a nuclear confrontation is absolutely unacceptable in the civilized world. So I start by saying I'm somewhat more optimistic than what I believe was, and maybe properly so, CV, the tone of the Secretary General's report. I don't want to be euphoric, but I have stayed, even in this job, in reasonably close touch with some of our own foreign policy, having attended all the cabinet meetings, both as ambassador here and then in this present job. And I just am, in terms of, I know our country's dedication, and I think I see it in others, a determination to avoid confrontation between major powers, which could indeed spill over into engaging others and causing them to choose up sides in one way or another. I'm more of a critic of the UN than when I came here, and I'm more of a supporter. A critic, and I think that there was kind of an unrealistic hope that it would be instant world government and instant world peace. And we suffered through a long period of time of one disappointment and after another, leading us to conclude that indeed it can't serve at this moment in history as a world government, and it can't bring instant world peace. On the other hand, it has an enormously constructive role to play in preventing crises, I think of the Middle East, and people can criticize the UN role, and I think with some justification at times, but if it hadn't been for the Security Council resolution that was on the table and out there, I don't think we'd have had the grounds for negotiation for peace in the Middle East, that was some of which was done certainly with UN knowledge and support, and some of which outside of the United Nations. The Cyprus situation is indeed a traumatic thing, and it's got all kinds of ominous overtones, and it does for our country, with our friendship for both of the principal countries, Greece and Turkey. But on the other hand, I think when you have a feeling in the part of the countries involved, the major powers involved, that they don't want confrontation, and indeed they do want negotiation to continue, I think we have less chance for an incident, unhappy one, troublesome one like that, to develop into something that's going to engage many of the other countries whose flags are flying outside in front of this building. I do see a limitation, and I think it's one that the United States should continue to review policy to put as much emphasis as we can on the political side of the United Nations. Having said that, I would agree with the thesis in Norman's question that we've got to strengthen the United Nations. And I think it can particularly be useful and supportive in the areas that were touched on by CV. Environmental issues, population issues, food, of course. I see, and I have a difference with some in our own foreign policy on this, of very, and I think anybody that serves as United States ambassador feels this way, almost a mandated increased role of support from the United States in these great economic and social areas. I believe it. I believe it's to our own self-interest to support the United Nations more in terms of these multilateral approaches. Instead, we've tried buying friendship through foreign aid, and it's done nothing but disturb every politician across this country, not solve the problems necessarily, and I don't mean to be overly critical of our aid people, because some of them are dedicated and do a first-class job. But I saw up here some real expertise, and I don't think, frankly, that it's fully appreciated in all councils of our government. And I think we must, particularly in these areas, strengthen the United Nations. I'd be open-minded. I certainly have no role. I don't mean to be sitting here as having any role in our policy at this juncture. But I do think that there are limitations that we all know of that have caused the United States problems in terms of the overall political setup here that will keep us from, you might say, surrendering foreign policy entirely of the United States to the United Nations. Nobody's suggesting we do that, incidentally. But I'm less of a pessimist. I don't mean to be insensitive to the terrible problems facing particularly some of the smaller countries in terms of hunger, in terms of population, which are just enormous. But I think here we have the machinery, you got the programs, you've got the expertise, the intelligence, and to help solve them. And I would simply conclude by agreeing that the United States needs to support the UN more in these important areas. I think there is an increasing political awareness in both parties in our country and in the Congress about the need to support the economic and social problems, particularly here. We are faced at home with enormous economic problems, which makes the time, I guess there's never a proper time, but makes the time unpropitious, because if we if we don't get this inflation under control in our own country, we will see these problems that you join in here to try to solve and to make a contribution towards solving today. You will see those economic problems made exacerbated rather than ameliorated. And this makes our ability, CV, to do as much as many of us would like to see, makes it less than it might be at another juncture in our history. But having said that, in terms of total dollars, in terms of total contribution, I am one who happens to feel that the United States should be indeed doing as much as we possibly can, even given these enormous problems we have at home, to help more through the United Nations to solve these social problems, the economic problems.
I wonder, Mr. Ambassador. We'll return in just a moment to the role of the U.S. at the UN, but I wonder, Mr. Ambassador, if you are hopeful that the process of détente can be extended to the People's Republic of China.
Well, the Shanghai Communique is of 72, entered into at the time of President Nixon's visit, is our doctrine in terms of our relationship with the People's Republic of China. I told Norman yesterday, don't ask me any questions about our relations with China, will you? I don't even have the job yet, and I darn sure have lots of studying to do before I go into it in depth. So he asked me a question about China, you know. But I would say that, and there's nothing, this isn't plowing any new ground, but the Shanghai Communique, which talks about further normalization of our relations between Peking and the United States, between People's Republic of China and the United States, is still a very valid document in our terms. The problems remain. You know what they are. I know what they are. But there is nothing in our policy, and there's nothing, I might say, in our change of administration here that should make anybody believe that there will be anything less than a determination on our part to enhance that Shanghai Communique in every way possible. And so I am one who looks forward to continual improvement in relations between our country and between the People's Republic of China. And having said that, I don't think that, and again I may sound a little naive to some of y'all, I don't think that should be interpreted as meaning that this will prevent our amelioration, improvement of relations between ourselves and any other country, large or small. Needn't be done in that way.
Are you excited about your new job?
Well, if I can get my wife to stop asking what kind of clothes they wear at this time of year over there and stuff, I can get into a little of the substance. You know, it's so new, and and it came up very suddenly, and I discussed it obviously with the President and the Secretary of State, and we really haven't had time. This will interest many of your friends here because they share my respect and affection for David Bruce. And I wired him today that Barbara and I have a very tough act to follow when you even try to do the job half as well as David and Evangeline Bruce. But I we're facing a little different problem, and we have a lot of kids scattered around, and we've got, we don't quite know how to get there yet, and I don't know whether there's any furniture out there, and we've got to get all these terribly important problems solved before we can begin to get into the relationships between the United States and the People's Republic. But I've never been more excited. I shouldn't say that with CV, because I was just overwhelmed when I first came to the United Nations, and I had the same sense of excitement about the job the day I left that I had the day I came here. But this one is especially after the trauma of the last year and a half, trauma for all our country, and certainly for those of us actively and proudly, I might say, involved in partisan politics. This is a change for me and my family, and it's something that I just am really looking forward to. And there was also some suggestions I might have another job, and that didn't work out here a while back. But and I don't want to be less than candid with you, because that was flattering attention, having been in this political arena. But when that didn't work, and the President made a first-class selection, in my judgment, in Nelson Rockefeller, and I'm convinced he'll be overwhelmingly and promptly confirmed by the United States Senate and the House. But when that flattering attention passed on by, as I think, well, it should have for our republic, and this came up, I just found that I, once again, out of coming in second, come in first, and I'm really excited about it.
You learned the Chinese language?
Well, I learned how to say thank you on the plane coming up, but that's as far as I've gone.
You know, it's very interesting. Only this morning, I was in a cab that stopped at the corner of 6th Avenue and 57th Street, and another cab was waiting for the light, and that driver yelled out to my driver. He said, "Where's the United Nations?" It was a Chinese cab driver, the only one I've seen in New York City. But coming back to the UNCV, we've now had a conference at Stockholm on the environment, and that's led to an agency that is established and functioning with a director who has a vision of what a clean world ought to be, environmentally that is. And that's in being. We've just had a conference in Romania on population, another conference on the law of the sea, a conference coming up on food, and then in 1975.
In regard to the sea, for example, they affect everything. Pollution. We talk about environment. The conference on the law of the sea has to deal with pollution. We talk about the problem of resources. One of the great problems facing the conference on the law of the sea is the utilization of resources outside of territorial limits. And that's the reason why they are arguing about a 12-mile limit, a 200-mile limit, and so on. Because as technology advances and the capacity to use resources beyond territorial waters increases, the question arises, who should use these resources? Only the rich countries which have the technological resources to use them? Or should the ocean beyond these frontiers be the common property of mankind? And any resources that are developed by the use of technological facilities outside territorial waters, how should they be distributed amongst the world's rich and poor? There are very fundamental problems involved here. Then, of course, there's the question of food. The over-utilization and exploitation of the resources of the sea could lead to depletion of food resources, which are very valuable, not just as food, but as a source of protein for millions of people who live in coastal waters. So all these problems are interrelated. And one way that the United Nations uses for dealing with problems is to convene a conference. Now, in every case, a conference does not always lead to an action program which you might consider admirable. In the case of Stockholm, it did happen that this led to the establishment of a new United Nations program. In the case of the World Population Conference, the distinguished Secretary General of that conference, Antonio Quirino Flores, a very distinguished Mexican, the finance minister of his country, foreign minister of his country. We were very lucky to get him to work for us, and a Catholic to boot, in charge of this population conference. He said at the very beginning that it was not his intention to propose one more program or one more agency to deal with these problems arising out of the World Population Conference. But meanwhile, let me tell you what the United Nations has done in this field and how it has developed in this field. And it illustrates the thesis I have always held about the United Nations. People want to know what the United Nations has done about a certain problem. In many cases, the fact is that the existence of the problem itself was brought to the awareness of people by the work of the United Nations. In the case of population, by the demographic unit of the United Nations, for so many years, a man called John Durand used to be the head of the United Nations demographic section. He was an American too. And he was the man who first brought these matters to the attention of the world at large, that there is a population problem. We are going to have 6 billion, 7 billion people by the end of the century if present population trends go unchecked. It was he who brought this to the attention of the United Nations and the world at large. Now, I joined the United Nations about 18 years ago. Just 3 or 4 days ago, I completed 18 years with the United Nations. And my first post was as the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Asia. Now, when I joined that post, I felt that the population problem, the demographic problem in all its aspects, was one of the most serious facing Asian countries. You know, of course, 3/5 of the population of the world live in Asia. China, for example, has a population of close to 800 million. In fact, there's a story that a lady was getting very worried because she was going to have her 5th child, and she had read somewhere that every 5th child born in this world is Chinese. India has a population of close to 600 million. Every 7th child born in this world is an Indian. If any woman is bearing a 7th child, she has better worry about that. Now, so I felt that this was very, very important problem. But my colleagues in the Secretariat, and they included people of great courage and distinction like Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish economist who was the head of the Economic Commission for Europe at that time. They said, CV, this is very dangerous stuff. Don't touch upon it. Don't press this problem too hard. But I did, because I was so sure that I was on the right track. And I was responsible for convening the first Asian population conference. I started work in FFA, which led to that, in the Economic Commission for Asia, which led to that. And it was only 5 years ago that we established very tentatively a fund for population activities. And if there is one man whose name should be associated with that fund for population activities, it is Bill Draper, General Draper. He was the man who was responsible for helping this fund set up. From $1 million a year, we have now gotten to the level of $50 to $60 million a year. Before long, it will be a $100 million a year fund. But this fund is not going to solve the population problem. The population problem can be solved only by national governments working in their best judgment to deal with it. Some might feel that their countries are underpopulated, that their country is underpopulated. They have a right to feel that way and increase their population. Other countries might feel, as mine does, that we are overpopulated. We have to do something to reduce the fertility rate. We have a right to do that too. But what happened in Bucharest, in the conference that ended only a week ago, was the stress, the emphasis was shifted from the problems of population to the problems of inequality in economic and social development. Because to a very large extent, these inequalities contribute to unrestricted or considerably increased population growth in the poorer countries, just as the increase in population contributes to disparities in economic and social development. Here you have the typical example of what is called a vicious circle. Coming to the food conference, as I said, I am very apprehensive that between now and the food conference, many millions of people might face hunger, as they are facing even now in my country, and in Bangladesh, where they've had floods. You only to look at the New York Times this morning to see what the situation is in my own country and what the situation is in Bangladesh. 600 million people in my country, close to 80 million in Bangladesh. tremendous problems are being faced by these countries. And here again, the problem is not a simple one. This energy business, for example, it has led to a shortage of fertilizers. In my own country, it has led to a shortage of oil for water pumps, for irrigation pumps. It has led to a shortage of so many other things, which make it very difficult to grow more food. These problems are going to be dealt with by the World Food Conference. Now, here there is a proposal of some kind to establish some kind of World Food Authority. You will find it in the report of the Secretary General of the Conference. But whether it is done by a new World Food Authority or whether it is done by existing organizations like the World Food Program with an increased and expanded mandate and the Food and Agriculture Organization, which already exists, that's not important. The important thing is that the world is facing this problem. And here I must say that the credit for bringing this World Food Conference to the stage at such short notice goes to Secretary of State Kissinger. It was he who a year ago in these halls, well, not quite a year ago, but 11 months ago, he proposed that we should have a World Food Conference to deal with these problems. And now we talk about food security, collective food security. And concepts like this are coming forward. But when we talk about the world food problem, we must realize that here again there's this problem of disparities between economic and social development. In this very room, sitting just where I am sitting, Senator Hubert Humphrey said that if every American ate one hamburger less a week, there would be enough food for 10 million people or 50 million people or some such figure. Well, I don't want to reduce the consumption of hamburgers or to reduce the profit levels of McDonald's. But one of the questions you will be asked in Rome in November, Secretary Butz will be asked, is it moral, let alone is it proper, is it moral to feed food grains which can be consumed by human beings to cattle in order to raise protein, when people are dying for lack of these very food grains the world over? That's the kind of question that you will be asked. Now, so far as the International Women's Conference is concerned, I must say that this is a decision of the General Assembly. We have had some preparatory meetings in Geneva. I don't imagine that the problem of equality of women in every walk of life is going to be solved either in the United Nations or in the United States over 1975. But this conference is again a way of drawing attention to a problem, of mobilizing public attention and public support for the solutions that this problem needs in order to be able to get over it over a period of time. We are all aware, of course, that the two most ancient sources of discrimination are those based on sex and those based on race. To a very large extent, these are due to the fact that the sources of this discrimination are visible. You can tell, not so easily nowadays, but you can usually tell a man from a woman. And you can also tell a white person from a colored person. And I hope very much that what we are trying to do in this field of human rights in the United Nations will extend not just to the question of equality of women, avoidance of discrimination based on sex, but also on race. And in fact, in the Secretary General's introduction to the annual report, he has devoted a section to the problem of human rights. On this question of discrimination, let me conclude by telling a very brief story. The story goes that after the first astronauts had orbited the Earth, there was a big reception in the White House, and there was a governor of a southern state who was a guest there, and he took one of these astronauts aside and they said, "Look, when you were going round and round, did you happen to meet God?" And the astronaut said, "Yes, Governor, not once but several times." And the governor asked him, "Tell me, he is white, isn't he?" And the astronaut said, "No, Governor, she is black."
Thank you very much, C.V. C.V., we'd like to welcome members of delegations to the United Nations as well as members of the staff of the UN to our meeting here. C.V., perhaps you might introduce some of them. I received a note saying that Ambassador Scally was in the audience. We can't see him with the blazing lights. Ambassador, are you here? CV?
I do recognize Ambassador Tabor, Denmark, and
Won't you please rise? Oh, yes, Ambassador Denmark.
Ambassador
Ambassador
Rydbeck,
Rydbeck.
from Sweden, I just said, and David Nicol is here from UNITAR.
Please stand, sir.
Ambassador Yankovic, Chief Yankovic from
Ambassador
Austria.
Yankovic from Australia.
Austria.
Austria, yes. Are there others we are missing?
You will see them at the reception.
Norman, may I comment
Please.
just briefly on that question? Because I expect from this audience particularly, Saturday Review readers, intellectually oriented people, you wonder, well, when Norman talked about barring, I forget how you phrased it, barring any radical surgery or something, it wasn't the way you said it, but something that would major change to strengthen the organization, I believe the way is without a single great structural change. Now, when I was here as a representative, and I know John Scally must get this all the time, people talk to me about structural change, and they're talking about changing voting in the General Assembly, put weight either for population or some economic formula in there. They say making it more, like the world really is. Why should a country with 150,000 people have a vote the same as one with 900 million people? And these are legitimate questions to ask, and they're unanswerable in terms of finding practical answers, in my opinion. So my own thesis is that it's next to impossible to get these things that Norman was talking about, great structural change, that some feel would make this thing more realistic in terms of the world as it really is, even more universal. So I would say, in a very brief answer to the question, and seconding what CV has said, that barring the structural change, that if we were all idealistically starting over, we might design the thing better. But if you started today to do it over again, you wouldn't kind of get it put back together at all, in my opinion. So I think, barring the structural change that each of us might feel in one way or another is necessary, that indeed these conferences and these existing independent agencies really are the hope for mankind multilaterally in solving these great problems. And there's no point wringing our hands about saying, well, this thing can't solve a war between Russia and the United States, or you didn't do much in the Middle East, or, point out the failures in Cyprus. I can point out to some things that weren't for the UN might have been a lot worse. But I think we ought to go from here recognizing that, yes, there are limitations, but there are these vehicles, be they conference, be they agencies, that if we give them the kind of support, as our country does in many instances, I think of Bangladesh Relief, our country, through the United Nations, handled, I think, CV, was around 70% or maybe 80% of the total commitment to relief. And we did it through the UN. And the UN did it better than the United States was equipped to do it at the time. And we didn't get too much credit for it. But I think the world understands that. As one of these successes comes after another, I think it's the way we ought to operate in that kind of thing. So I would say, don't worry if it's not perfection in terms of structure, and concentrate on the things. And CV's analysis of the population conference under former Foreign Minister Flores is an excellent one. Here's real class, real ability there. We ought to be supporting that as much as we possibly can.
Thank you. Perhaps in the few minutes that remain, we might have some questions or comments from the audience. Please feel free to address your question to either to the Undersecretary General or to Ambassador Bush. He will just refer them. I'm not sure I can see through the lights, but speak up, please. Yes, sir.
Short time week ago, and if I quoted correctly, the gist of it was that there are a dozen or so giant corporations in the world that exercise a great deal of power over the things that happen in this world. And because of their great concern for profit, they're not taking the steps that they might take to help alleviate some of the situations that exist. that if these corporations or these corporation heads could be brought together, that perhaps they could make a much greater contribution to some of the world's problems than they are. Would either of you care to comment on that?
Mr. Ambassador?
Go ahead, address and let me follow, see that you run out of date on what you
The role of multinational corporations, and most recently they have been called transnational corporations, in regard to especially the economic and social development of the poor countries, has been the subject of a very serious and lengthy study. First of all, the Secretary General appointed a group of 20 what were called eminent men to deal with this problem. They held public hearings. In fact, in this very room, they had Ralph Nader, amongst others, and it was a very widely publicized event. But they did not just meet with Ralph Nader. They met with the presidents of major transnational corporations. They met with important labor leaders. They met with everyone who can throw some light on this question. Now, as a result of the report of this group of eminent men, there was a meeting of the Economic and Social Council in Geneva in the months of, late July, the whole of July and the first day or two of August. And they have adopted a decision to keep this matter under continuing review, to establish a secretariat unit to deal with this problem, and to leave the question of how the activities of these transnational corporations might be monitored and so on, from the point of view of the economic and social development, maximum contribution to the economic and social development of the poor countries. Now here, I might say, the emphasis has not been on what the questioner has in mind, the contribution that they could make. The emphasis has rather been on how could you ensure that the contribution that they make is not just devoted to exploiting the natural resources of a poor country and benefiting the stockholders of the transnational corporation. How can you make sure that these benefits are shared fairly and equitably by the governments of the poor countries themselves? That has been the emphasis. And to some extent, as you know, the fact that this item was put on the agenda by the representative of Chile 2 years ago will show you the background. I don't have to say more on that subject. Will show you the background against which this particular study was inaugurated. But it has not ended on that note. It has ended on a more constructive note, and we might expect that from now on some special efforts would be made to make sure that the transnational corporations are enabled to make a contribution, but in order not to benefit their stockholders alone, but mainly the poor countries whose resources they exploit and where they operate.
Are there other questions?
There was one over here.
Was there one on? Yes, sir.
May I ask, on this very interesting afternoon, where is the man who says, let's quit fighting over it, there'll be plenty to go around, Mr. Buckminster Fuller?
Bucky Fuller is now in Maine on his wonderful little island, Bear Island, and this is a sacred time for him. Each year he permits himself this particular luxury, and we're glad that he's there.
I have a question for Ambassador Bush. I agree that there isn't any realistic chance of our bringing about major structural improvement in the UN, and that we must put our hope in these specialized agencies which try to persuade. But as we learn more and more about the delicate balances of the ecosystem to which we belong, with which we are today tampering, it seems to me that this is tantamount, if we were to translate it into the way we behave normally, to asking most people to obey the law without any police. Let's take one illustration. Well, in this morning's Times, the ozone problem. Perhaps an even more interesting one, and a little less hard to get hold of. the fact that for the first time a few months ago, a group of scientists working on the pioneer level in biology, working with viruses and the creation of new viruses, begged their fellow scientists to do no further research in this area for fear of turning up a virus that our environment couldn't contend with. And, you know, it's a matter of persuasion, and yet they're fooling with the delicate, balanced ecosystem which permits us to survive, and trying to do it by, you know, won't you please. Aren't we flying in the face of all of our past experience if we realize we're now getting into this point of damaging the ecosystem, unless we also begin to think in terms of some way to do more than say, please, please?
The United Nations has seldom used and has available machinery relating to sanctions. It was hard for me to totally grasp, but and certainly the problems were much more clearly in focus here now than they were just 2 years ago in terms of the environment. But many countries would look to us with our increasing awareness on environmental matters and say, look, that's fine for you. You're developed. You're rich. You're so much per capita. You've got it made. And we're trying to get a little elbow room here in whatever continent they might have been on. And I think, and CV would have a better perspective on this than I, that we have to be somewhat sensitive, not to permitting or to doing anything less than discouraging in all total resource those countries that might be less acutely attuned to certain environmental standards that say we have, or that someone like yourself would know very clearly the world needs. It has to be, I really stopped short of seeing a system that would be practically implemented here for the discipline that you correctly assess is needed in some situations. Certainly it's needed in military situations. Certainly it's needed in coping with environmental. Certainly it's needed in transgressions in terms of oceans or something like this. But I stopped short, CV, of seeing, I understand what Mr. Harrington means, but I don't see from my experience here a practical answer to that question in terms of the policing that he feels would make these goals more attainable. Do you?
In limited ways, yes. George Bush is absolutely right. For example, the poor countries feel that the problem of pollution has been really created by the rich countries. The problem of overexploitation of natural resources has been created by the rich countries. That is not their problem, really. Now, I personally don't think that there is any conflict between due regard for the environment and economic development. It might cost a little more, but you might just as well begin right. But many poor countries don't share that view. They feel economic development first, and then we will have the money to deal with the pollution that the economic development has created. This is an understandable scheme of priority. But what Reverend Harrington refers to can be done in limited areas, and there again it can be done by the kind of machinery I was talking about earlier. For example, in regard to pollution. In regard to marine pollution, for example, you can adopt a new code for tanker construction and design, which prevents some of these spills, which prevents some of this flushing out of sludge into the open sea and so on. Those of you who have not seen the movie, The Raw Expeditions, I would suggest that you see it. I remember very well that Norman, in fact it was Norman Cousins who brought Thor Heyerdahl to the United Nations. We had a little ceremony in the Dag Hammarskjöld Auditorium, and the book was launched. And you can see from this movie how marine pollution is endemic over the entire Atlantic Ocean. Everywhere the Raw Expedition people found that there was, Thor Heyerdahl found that there was pollution, especially oil pollution. Now that can be dealt with. You can deal with the problem like the extinction of the whale, for example, by having a moratorium on fishing for whales. In limited areas you can do that. But by and large, in the whole scheme of things, you can only do what people are willing to do, what they accept as reasonable and fair. And this is where that element of persuasion, that element of appealing to the sense of fairness of people, which you do so well in your own community church, it is this that is really going ultimately to save the human race. Because just as a police force could not keep peace if the majority of citizens were not law-abiding, the United Nations cannot enforce sanctions, even if they exist, unless there is a willingness generally on the part of the community to recognize that these limitations on their freedom of action are good for them as well as for others. Now, what is, you talked about the stratosphere and this New York Times report. It only shows how much George missed by not reading today's New York Times. Yes, well, there have been reports about this, not just from the point of view of nuclear weapons, which was the theme today, but from the point of view of using supersonic planes, what danger they might do to the stratosphere and the ionosphere. The only good thing is, it seems as though the supersonic planes are going to be impractical from the point of view of economic considerations rather than from the point of view of environmental considerations. I personally think that we are flying fast enough right now.
You know, at TV, I think that Don Harrington has a dream which we all share, and I think this is what the Stratton Review is really dedicated to. That this world and everything in it belongs to the people who inhabit it, and that we may yet develop the institutions adequate to making this world and everything in it safe for the human race. And that, I think, is what Don means by world citizenship and world law, and I think that's where we all come together. I'd like to ask Spencer to come forward and close the meeting.
Always a pleasure to greet CV and thank him for coming. And Ambassador Bush, I should just like to quote two lines from the most recent issue of my favorite magazine by one of my favorite writers. Quote, "A good magazine requires more than editorial craftsmanship. It requires the editors to pour their love into it. There is a great deal of love in all the SR family. That includes the readers, the writers, the board, and our friends. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you the chairman of our board of directors, a great public servant, a former ambassador to the United States and Rhodes Scholar, George McGee."
Thank you very much, Spencer. I come here in the performance of a most pleasant duty. I've enjoyed, as have all of you, I'm sure, the delightful program we've had today involving distinguished guests and loyal leaders, celebrating the 50th anniversary of, I'm just going to say, Saturday Review, because, as you may know, the world portion will be dropped soon. But we all know that in a very real sense, this is a tribute to one man, a very remarkable man, who for 34 years has edited and directed the course of this magazine. It's been the privilege of my wife and myself to have known him for this entire period. And it's my very pleasant duty on behalf of the board and the editors and the officers and staff of the Saturday Review to express to him our appreciation and to present him with a little gift in token of this occasion. All of us know Norman as the master of his chosen profession, the conjurer of ideas, the dealer in words, who can inspire others to write as he himself writes. We know his intellectual preoccupations, his concern for the condition of man, his concern for the environment, his concern for the richness of life. There's another side to Norman that those of us know him personally are very aware of, and this is his tremendous zest for life,
his tremendous compassion for those around him. It's very appropriate that just at this time there is being announced a new book, his latest book, which gives his philosophy of life. I hope when it is issued by Harper and Row that you will read it, The Celebration of Life. In this book, you will find Norman as the tennis player, Norman as the golfer, Norman as the chess player, Norman as the man who will dash across the continent to speak to a group of students and stay up all night talking with him. Here is the man who was capable of the tremendous compassion toward the maidens of Hiroshima. Here's the man whom we all know has engaged in countless acts of generosity with individuals one never knows about unless you happen to. I can't tell you what an honor it is for me to pay this tribute to this remarkable man and to present him on this occasion with a little token of the love and appreciation of his colleagues. Among his